Mark Juergensmeyer was born in 1940 in Carlinville, Illinois, and received his degree in philosophy from the University of Illinois at Urbana in 1962. He spent the next 3 years completing a Master of Divinity degree from Union Theological Seminary in New York before moving to Berkeley in 1965. There he earned a 1968 MA and 1974 PhD in political science, and remained in Berkeley working at the Graduate Theological Union and the Center for South and Southeast Asian Studies for the next 15 years. He spent 5 years at the University of Hawaii before moving in 1993 to his present position at the University of California at Santa Barbara, where he again combines positions in sociology, international affairs, and religious studies. This article gives us a look inside what has become the highest profile, most notorious, and perhaps most violent terrorist group in the world, variously known by the labels ISIS, the Islamic State, ISIL, or by its Arabic initials, Daesh, which means bullies. Like the blind men with the elephant again, different people perceive and interpret ISIS from amazingly different perspectives. Based on his extensive personal research, Juergensmeyer tries to give us a sociological insight as what he sees as at least 3 different worldviews, all visible among various followers of this group, that creates an intimate link between religion and violence. Trying to understand what is going on in the Middle East in the 21st century can be just as baffling as it was in the 20th century, or for that matter, any time back through history. This region at the crossroads of the earth always has witnessed rip currents of competing interests and forces, and religion has always been an important dimension of those currents. Juergensmeyer's article allows us to focus on one particularly nasty example of our current topic of religion and violence, the strange and frightening group usually known as ISIS. This global menace first appeared in 2004 after the invasion of Iraq by the United States and his allies to get rid of the dictator Saddam Hussein. Even though the United States previously armed and supported Hussein in his war against Iran, he had to go because he got greedy and attacked our favorite Arab friends in little nearby Gulf states like Kuwait, who live floating on an ocean of buried petroleum. After quickly conquering Iraq and capturing Hussein from the hole in the ground where he was hiding, the victorious allies disarmed and disbanded the Iraqi dictator's army and security forces and told them all to go home. This produced a near total political vacuum in the country, only held together at that point by the occupying forces. We all know how nature can't stand a vacuum. The poisonous gas that leaked in to fill the vacuum in this case was ISIS. It is impossible to understand the situation in the Middle East, then or now, until you grasp the geography of Islam. Just as Christianity split between Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox in 1056, Islam began to come apart at the seams as soon as its original prophet Muhammad passed from the earth. The theological excuse for this split concerns who speaks for Muhammad and interprets the Quran today. One group, the Shia, insists that only descendants of Muhammad's own family have this direct line to Allah. The other group, the Sunnis, do not accept this family inheritance theory, relying instead on traditions developed by the elders of Islamic communities. The map of the two sides of Islam shows the Shia concentrated in Iran, but with minorities lapping over into neighboring countries, including particularly the rich river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in eastern Iraq. Nearly everywhere else, the Islamic world is dominated by Sunnis. As Juergensmeyer explains, Iraq also has a slight majority of Shia Muslims in the population, but under Saddam Hussein's rule, the Sunnis in the country actually enjoyed a political advantage and held most of the top positions in government, the military, and the economy. Saddam Hussein, you see, came from a Sunni town in the arid, less populated western part of the country. The Shia majority in Iraq felt excluded and discriminated against for generations in recent history. With Saddam out of the way, They have used the power of the ballot box to take control of the government, supported by many private Shia militia groups armed and funded by their eastern neighbor, Iran. Now in control, the Shia-dominated government has a grudge against the Sunnis. Now it is their turn to be discriminated against and persecuted. Sunnis got quite frightened and nervous after 2003 as the Shia took over running Iraq. Juergensmeyer details for us how outside radicals sneaked into western Iraq and took advantage of the fears of the Sunnis living there. The first of these was a petty criminal named Abu Musab al-Zakari, who grew up in a Palestinian refugee family and eventually fell under the spell of the Saudi Arabian version of Sunni Islam called Wahhabism, with its rigid, puritanical rules about the restricted role of women, violent punishment for lawbreakers, and a general attitude that life would just be better if we could turn back the clock to the good old days of Muhammad himself, or at least maybe back to the 12th century or so. Al-Zarqawi scared the wits out of the Sunni elders in Iraq, but at least he was on their side. This brings us to the first of Juergensmeyer's explanation for who became followers of ISIS. The Sunnis in western Iraq, worried about the country slipping under the control of their Shia opponents, have always been the main population base of support for ISIS. This support was never based on a general agreement with the radical religious doctrines of al-Zarqawi or any of the other foreign fanatics who started the ISIS movement. The local population supported these fanatics on a purely pragmatic basis. These were the only people who looked toward a future in which Sunni Muslims would be in control of their own destinies. The best evidence of this pragmatic basis for supporting ISIS came a few years later, when U.S. General David Petraeus was put in charge of the effort to get rid of ISIS in western Iraq. He pulled the foreign troops occupying the western part of the country back to Baghdad in the east and turned over local political control to the traditional Sunni tribal leaders in the region. Within a couple of years, looking forward to running their own lives again, these traditional leaders rapidly lost interest in ISIS and it nearly dried up and disappeared. Radical gangs are always like fish. They must be surrounded by water in which they can swim, and Petraeus's awakening strategy dried up the water. Unfortunately, President George Bush then decided that things were going so well, it was time to bring most of the U.S. troops home. It would be up to the Iraqis to sort out their own affairs. The Shia majority in the eastern region, with lots of financial and military support from Iran, sorted out these affairs just as you might expect, with themselves in charge and the Sunnis out in the cold again, getting back to basics of being the persecuted minority. International aid money coming into the country was used mostly to support and develop this growing Shia dominance in government and the economy. You can guess the result without too much trouble, though we might also add in the start of a civil war in Syria to the west on top of everything else. Syria also had a dictator like Saddam Hussein, named Assad, but since Syria has no oil, nobody cared what happened there. Assad and his family are from another splinter group of Islam that is more or less aligned with the Shia side of the split, so that in the Syrian army and government, Sunnis always got the lower spots and Assad's group gets all the top spots. Since the Sunnis amount to about 3/4 of all the people in Syria, they've always been unhappy about this. With anti-Sunni governments to the west of them in Damascus in Syria and to the east of them in Baghdad in Iraq, all these Sunnis out in the desert in the middle were literally between a rock and a hard place. When you have no place else to go, and when these radical extremists talking about cutting off people's heads sneak back into town with lots of money in their pockets from Saudi Arabia, it should not be that surprising that ISIS, in Juergensmeyer's words, came roaring back. We've seen why these Sunnis caught in the middle between Damascus and Baghdad went along with the nightmare, but they are only one strand of the larger picture that Juergensmeyer is weaving. We'll turn next to the others. We may not approve, but we may understand the motives of Sunni Muslims living in eastern Syria and western Iraq. Surrounded to both east and west by religious beliefs hostile to their own, these local Sunnis turned to ISIS, as Juergensmeyer tells us, only when all their other options seem to have run out. But there is another group of followers within ISIS that is even harder to understand. As some of the survivors of ISIS rule told him, none of the masked fighters that swooped into their towns and started to reorganize their lives seemed to be locals. They were not even Iraqis. Like the first leaders of the terrorist group, they were mostly foreigners. They came from Palestinian settlements, from Egypt and Saudi Arabia, from the southern republics of the former Soviet Union, even from France and Sweden and all over the place. I can't get out of my head Juergensmeyer's description of these kids sitting on planes on their way to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS, reading quick summaries like Jihad for Dummies, because they had little or no idea what Islam actually taught or what they were getting into. Few of us can put ourselves in the place of these wannabe jihadis or make any sense out of what they were doing. We might start by examining what little data we can find about just who these international jihadis were. The largest numbers have come from former Soviet republics along the southern border of Russia, from Saudi Arabia, and other countries in the Middle East and North Africa. These are all countries where Sunni Islam is the dominant religion. We can find some shred of connection to the idea of Sunni solidarity in the face of Shia persecution. But what about France and Germany and other Western non-Islamic societies? Journalists go crazy when they find a story about a seemingly ordinary Swedish or French or American teenager charging an airline ticket on their parents' credit card and sneaking off to the airport to fly to Syria and cut off people's heads and blow things up. Such stories are like being struck by lightning. They're also just about as common as being struck by lightning. Most of the international jihadis coming from France or Sweden or England are immigrants from other war-torn countries where Islam is either on the attack or under attack. They usually arrive in these Western countries as children, growing up with foreign Islamic parents in a new society that treats them with strong suspicion and very little understanding. Within themselves, they feel the split between the culture and religion of their family heritage and the new culture into which they must find their way. Juergensmeyer discusses at length the work of Thomas Hegghammer, who he describes as the greatest living expert on jihadi movements. The question they both want to answer is not just why a young person might throw away all possibilities of life at home, whether in Saudi Arabia or in Paris or Los Angeles, and rush off to join an ultra-violent extremist group in the desert. They also want to know how such a choice even became a possibility. Hegghammer's answer to the why question is not about deep Islamic theology and philosophy, nor does it have anything to do with the practical, pragmatic, let's make a deal logic of local Sunnis grasping at straws to avoid Shia dominance. This why is much simpler. It's just a matter of wanting to be part of a community. His answer to the how question is equally simple. It's the internet. These young adults in Cairo or Copenhagen, peering into their phones or laptops while their parents cook traditional recipes in the background, find the slick websites constructed by ISIS webmasters. The resulting conversations take us straight back to cult recruiters like the Moonies or the Scientologists. The only difference now is that they offer virtual peanut butter sandwiches instead of the real thing. People tell you that you're important. The cause is important. There's danger and adventure and glory waiting out there. In short, they give you both a meaning for your life that feels larger than life and a feeling of belonging to a community with a new set of friends all around the globe. The best part is that this community is real, at least in the sense that you and the other people in it are real people, not avatars in World of Warcraft or something. Several decades ago, William Kornhauser warned us about this dangerous illusion in his writings on what he called mass society. As human societies become larger and larger, more differentiated into separate institutional spheres, the sources of organizational control and coordination inevitably also retreat beyond our personal lives, becoming more distant and impersonal. We belong to social classes or to ethnic groups, not to local neighborhoods. Kornhauser also implicitly assumes that human beings all need what he called community. Juergensmeyer agrees. And if your world gets bigger, more impersonal, with freeways instead of sidewalks, and crowds of strangers instead of lifelong acquaintances, you hunger for the sense of community you've lost. This makes you an easy target for any religion, political party, or perhaps just corporations selling stuff that can offer you even an illusion of community. Kornhauser calls this illusion pseudo-community. You might join the Moonies to find this community. You might join a street gang. You might become a video game addict, leveling up in your imagination with your real life on hold. Or you might sneak onto a plane and fly off to Iraq, depending on which websites have managed to rope you in. But Juergensmeyer is not finished when he's explored the local Sunni pragmatists in Iraq and Syria, and the lonely people who fall for the internet lure of pseudo-community. He also found a third group involved in ISIS for very different reasons. These are the really dangerous characters. The details may vary, but the extremism is always the same. The entire world is going to hell in a handcart. The end times are drawing near. The final battle between good and evil actually has started already. Before long, we'll all be dead anyway, either in heaven or in hell. If you want to end up in heaven, you better get on board with them. Everybody else can, quite literally, go to hell. In fact, these people are happy to help them on their way. Juergensmeyer emphasizes that these people with heads full of the apocalypse are not unique to Islam. You can find them among Christians or anywhere else you want to look. They are rarely from impoverished and illiterate backgrounds. People worrying about where to sleep or how to feed their children don't have time to argue theology or indulge in extravagant visions of the end of the world. They're more concerned about the end of the month. Osama bin Laden came from one of the richest, most privileged families in Saudi Arabia. Neither Marx nor Engels, authors of the Communist Manifesto, ever worked in a factory alongside their beloved working class. These guys are usually from privileged backgrounds, so they can afford to indulge their fantasies. These three very different groups inside ISIS raise another tricky question for Juergensmeyer. What in the world do they have in common? How can the local Sunni pragmatists, the naive wannabe jihadis chasing their pseudo-community, and the fanatics in search of the apocalypse actually end up sleeping in the same village in the Syrian desert, planning bloodthirsty rampages in nearby towns, and ducking for cover from Russian or American airstrikes? It all sounds so unlikely, and yet there they are all together. Juergensmeyer suggests that they all share what he calls a worldview, a combination of beliefs and a sense of community that bind them to one another. There's a whole literature about this idea of worldviews that we don't have time to explore, but you might want to learn more on your own. In the meantime, we have one more issue to explore. What's going to happen to these three unlikely partner groups if ISIS finally falls apart and they're all on their own again? That's our final topic. Predicting the future generally is a fool's errand, but since Juergensmeyer discusses possibilities for what might happen next, we'll consider those possibilities for what they can tell us about the more general topic of religious conflict and religion in society. Given all the twists and turns, the sudden reversals popping up so far in the 21st century, we can only plot any future for the followers of ISIS by making alternative assumptions about the larger international context that produced them. If the Iranians and the Saudis and the Turks and the Russians and the Americans continue to move around the people of the Middle East like pieces on a chessboard, ISIS might continue flailing around desperately out in the desert between Damascus and Baghdad. They might continue to attract marginalized young adults and fanatics from other countries to their virtual Islamic state, even if the Muslim establishment continues to insist that they are not Islamic and no other country recognizes them as a state. The other extreme limiting case, however, might see ISIS fall to pieces as quickly as it appeared nearly 2 decades ago, leaving behind only memories of the horrors committed in its name and a scattered group of very confused former followers. If that evaporation of ISIS as an organized group in control of actual territory came to pass, what would be the fate of each of the 3 different constituencies described by Juergensmeyer? The biggest step to eliminating ISIS from its territory in eastern Syria and western Iraq is actually well understood as a result of past experience. Sunni Muslims today live as a disenfranchised majority in Syria and as a disenfranchised minority in Iraq. Their hopelessness and frustration provide the fuel that has kept ISIS fires burning for a generation now. They have Sunni allies in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and many other countries. If somehow they could gain a feeling of security and control over their own lives, returning to life in communities where their local elders were honored and respected as leaders, something like normal, peaceful life could return for them. In the past, only dictators like Assad or Saddam Hussein could stifle the religious conflict between Sunni and Shia that has persisted for so many centuries, but nothing is impossible. What would be best for these people, though, may not fit with what the foreign powers all around them want. So the most important question will be, as it has been in the past, can the ordinary people caught in this crossfire find a way to control their own lives? Can these communities find hope for a new future? If the ordinary people in the region could regain control of their own lives, the fuel for the ISIS fire would disappear. But the webmasters and online magazines and chat sites would still exist, a new social reality that does not seem to need any actual territorial basis. The appeal of pseudo-communities in our new virtual landscape means that marginalized people will continue to escape into these illusions. So the second question concerns whether refugees and other immigrants from the world's shifting hotspots of conflict, including religious conflict, will be ghettoized, feared, and excluded in countries where they try to take refuge, or whether these countries may make more concerted efforts to welcome them, to help them find constructive lives and social acceptance in what could be their new homes. Escaping into virtual reality has a certain hypnotic appeal, but hopefully these illusions can't compete with the satisfaction that can flow from genuine connections to real people in the real world. We all can do our parts to ensure that every society appreciates all the people in it, so fewer of them feel the need of such cyber escape. But finally, the third group discussed by Juergensmeyer remains the real problem. Apparently, there will always be an endless supply of fanatics, those odd individuals who become obsessed with visions that they have constructed inside their own heads, so obsessed that they have to go and live in these worlds of their dreams. If ISIS loses its grip on the Sunnis in the deserts of western Iraq and eastern Syria, and if fewer people are seduced by the ISIS webmasters trolling for the lonely and marginalized, these true believers will still be out there, obsessing over their personal demons and dreams. We can't eliminate them all. We can only try to insulate ourselves from their manias and nightmares. The entire ISIS story, in fact, fits very neatly into the resource mobilization approach to understanding any social movement. The Sunnis in the desert are the bystander population, within which the movement comes into being. Some of them become adherents who accept and support the movement, according to Juergensmeyer, mostly for purely pragmatic, let's make a deal reasons to regain control of their own lives and communities. The international jihadis who fly in from Tunisia or France looking for a community to give their lives meaning and importance are the constituents who sacrifice their time, their treasure, and quite possibly also their lives for the cause. But none of this would happen without the religious entrepreneurs, the fanatics who put the move in social movement. The outer layers of the movement are easiest to disrupt, but the core of true believers is what will always threaten to light the fires all over again if they can just find some new fuel. Lest we end on a negative note, it is good to remember that when people get together and build up their personal religious experiences into larger social organizations called religions, the resource mobilization perspective will always help us to understand how this construction process gets started. But it doesn't tell us whether the result is an increase in human happiness or in human misery. As a social institution concerned with ultimate values of good and evil, right and wrong, justice and injustice, religion is uniquely capable of serving as a tool that we can use in either direction. We've explored many different aspects of religious authority, organization, and action in the lives of believers. Even in our contemporary, fast-paced, interconnected, and incredibly complex world, where religion often is reduced to just one institution among many, it still consistently displays unparalleled power to motivate us, to organize us, and to satisfy our needs for both meaning and community. It appears to be with us to stay in human societies. How you feel about this, whether it makes you pessimistic or optimistic, is up to you. Personally, I'll go along with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., that while the arc of the moral universe is long, it bends towards justice, that religion can do more good than ill in the world. But it's our job to get out there and participate in our cultures and try and make it so.